Hey guys, tonight we begin with something slow, dim, and comfortably bleak. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. This is one of those stories that moves at a walking pace. No urgency, just a long drift backward into a time when life was cheaper, rules were arbitrary, and the concept of human rights had not yet arrived at the meeting. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, breathe. Tonight we're talking about what life was really like before human rights existed. Not the romantic version with tasteful candlelight and heroic speeches. The slower, pettier, more uncomfortable reality. The kind where most people were born tired and stayed that way. For most of history, there was no idea that simply being human came with built-in protections. No universal dignity, no baseline expectations. Life was arranged vertically, like a badly designed ladder. A few people at the top enjoyed warmth, softness, and choices. Everyone else existed to support that arrangement and was expected to be grateful about it. Let's start gently with the basic assumption of the pre-rights world. Power decided worth. If you had power, your suffering mattered. If you did not, it was considered normal background noise, like wind or mud. This was not usually framed as cruelty. It was framed as order, God's order, nature's order, tradition's order, a very convenient order. Most people were born into a role and stayed there. A peasant child was not an undeveloped anything. They were already complete in society's eyes. Their future was not a mystery. They would work, age early, and die with very little documentation. No one needed to explain this to them. It was everywhere. Meanwhile, far above them, elites lived lives that looked luxurious from a distance and deeply strange up close. Royals, nobles, and high clergy were technically the most protected humans in existence, yet even they were trapped in systems that treated people as tools, symbols, or bargaining chips. Comfort did not mean freedom. It just meant softer furniture while being controlled. Take birth, for example. In a world without rights, birth was less a miracle and more an inspection. Noble babies were evaluated like long-term investments. Strong limbs were celebrated. Weakness caused quiet concern. If the child survived infancy, which was never guaranteed, their body and future immediately belonged to the dynasty. Royal children were raised like state property. Their marriages were planned before their personalities formed. Their education focused on obedience, lineage, and not embarrassing the family name too publicly. Emotional needs were considered decorative, useful if present, ignorable if inconvenient. And if a royal child was sickly, awkward, or mentally fragile, that was simply unfortunate branding. The solution was not care, but concealment. Keep them out of sight, keep them quiet, marry them strategically, produce heirs if possible. If not, move on emotionally and try again. Down below, peasant children worked almost as soon as they could stand without falling over. Childhood was short and unpaid. Discipline was physical and constant. Hunger was a familiar companion. There was no concept of protection from labor, abuse, or neglect. These were not crimes, they were life. If someone was beaten by a landlord, starved by taxes, or worked until collapse, it was not injustice, it was misfortune. And misfortune did not require correction, it required endurance. Law existed, but it was not there to protect everyone. Law existed to stabilize power. Courts cared deeply about property, inheritance, and loyalty. Human suffering was secondary and often invisible unless it disrupted something important. Punishments were public, slow, and symbolic, not because people were especially sadistic, but because fear was efficient. Fear kept order cheaper than kindness ever could. There was no concern for rehabilitation. There was only correction and example. Now let's float upward again to the people who technically had it best. Kings and queens lived surrounded by servants, but rarely alone. Privacy was suspicious. Privacy suggested secrets. A royal body was a public asset. Even sleeping arrangements were monitored. Someone was always nearby, adjusting curtains, observing routines, reporting behaviors. Imagine never being alone with your own thoughts without someone taking notes. That was luxury. Royal marriages were contracts wearing costumes. Love was irrelevant. Compatibility was optional. Fertility was mandatory. A queen's value rested almost entirely in her ability to produce sons and not die doing it. If she failed, blame followed quickly. Medical understanding was poor, but judgment was excellent. If a queen miscarried repeatedly, whispers grew. God was displeased. Her bloodline was flawed. Her body was uncooperative. None of this counted as cruelty. It counted as commentary. And if she died in childbirth, which happened often, she was praised for her sacrifice and replaced efficiently. Mourning periods were short. Dynasties did not pause for grief. Kings were expected to perform strength at all times. Illness was weakness. Sadness was suspicious. Mental strain was ignored until it became inconvenient. Many kings self-medicated with alcohol, food, or elaborate rituals designed to assure them that they were chosen, special, and definitely in control. Some kings ruled for decades while barely functioning, shielded by advisors who made decisions in their name. Others ruled with manic energy, issuing decrees that changed daily. Stability depended entirely on personality. There were no safeguards, no limits, no mechanism to intervene politely. And the idea that common people might deserve protection from this instability simply did not exist. Subjects absorbed consequences quietly. Failed harvests, wars of ego, sudden tax hikes, forced conscriptions. These were facts of life, like weather, except less predictable and more personal. Religion helped explain this arrangement. Suffering was framed as meaningful. Endurance was moral. Obedience was holy. Questioning authority was dangerous not only politically, but spiritually. If life was unfair, that was part of a larger plan, a plan no one could see, but everyone was required to accept. Charity existed, but it was optional and theatrical. A noble might sponsor a hospital or distribute bread during a festival, gaining praise and reputation. This was generosity, not obligation. The poor were expected to be grateful, quiet, and visible only when useful as evidence of virtue. There was no safety net. Injury meant poverty. Illness meant dependency. Old age meant hoping someone tolerated your continued existence. Families absorbed damage until they collapsed. Communities helped when they could, not because of rights, but because neglect eventually caused problems everyone had to deal with. Even within families, authority was absolute. Fathers ruled households like miniature monarchies. Wives had limited legal identity. Children had none. Discipline was unchecked. Affection was inconsistent. Survival mattered more than comfort. Marriage among common people was practical and constrained. Among elites, it was political and suffocating. Either way, choice was limited. Divorce was rare or impossible. Abuse was private. And yet, people adapted. Humans are good at adapting to systems, even terrible ones. They found small joys, seasonal festivals, storytelling, food rituals, gossip, quiet rebellion in the form of humor and shared misery. Life moved slowly. News traveled at the speed of feet and horses. A decision made in a palace might take weeks to arrive somewhere else, by which time it had already ruined several lives. This delay created a strange emotional distance. Tragedy felt normal because it was constant and unresolved. There was no expectation that tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow was just another version of today, possibly wetter. Progress was not a shared goal. Stability was. And stability meant keeping everyone exactly where they were. The absence of rights did not feel like an absence to the people living in it. It felt like reality. The idea that suffering could be reduced through structure, that power could be limited, that dignity could be universal, had not yet fully formed. For now, this was the world. Hierarchical, inflexible, quietly exhausting. A place where survival was success and comfort was suspicious. Let's drift onward from here deeper into individual lives shaped by this system. Kings who broke under it, queens who vanished inside it, children molded until nothing soft remained. The world before human rights was not constantly screaming. It was murmuring, slowly, endlessly. And for most people, that murmur was all they ever knew. As we continue drifting through this earlier world, nothing really changes suddenly. There are no clean turning points, just layers, more routines, more accepted discomfort. The kind that becomes invisible because everyone shares it and no one has the energy to question it. In a time before rights, survival itself was considered a privilege, not a guarantee. If you've made it to adulthood, that was already a small victory. If you made it to old age, people quietly assumed you had either good luck or a strong tolerance for misery, possibly both. Let's sink back into everyday life for ordinary people, because that's where the absence of rights is felt most consistently. Work was not something you clocked into. It was something you existed inside. Farming, craft labor, domestic service, mining, hauling, sewing, brewing. The workday followed daylight, seasons, and whoever happened to own you, employ you, or outrank you. There were no labor protections, no weekends, no concept of burnout. Exhaustion was expected. Injury was common. Losing fingers, teeth, mobility, or eyesight simply adjusted your role downward. If you could no longer work, you became a burden, and burdens were tolerated as long as they didn't inconvenience the wrong person. Payment was inconsistent. Sometimes wages arrived late, sometimes not at all. Complaining was risky. Employers had social power, legal power, and often physical power. Workers had very little leverage besides collective anger, which authorities were very good at crushing before it became interesting. Food scarcity was normal. Hunger was seasonal. You learned to stretch meals, dilute stews, and accept that some days would feel thin. If a harvest failed or a tax collector arrived early, that hunger turned sharp and immediate. Starvation was not rare enough to shock anyone. Meanwhile, elites dined extravagantly and documented their menus in loving detail. This contrast was not hidden. It was openly displayed as proof of hierarchy. The feast and the famine existed at the same time, often within walking distance. Disease moved freely. Without sanitation or medical understanding, illness was treated with superstition, prayer, or deeply unhelpful remedies. Bloodletting was popular, so were purges. If you survived treatment, it was credited to divine mercy. If you died, it was divine will. Either way, no one was sued. Plagues swept through cities and villages, taking lives quickly and unevenly. The poor died first and in greater numbers. The wealthy fled, isolating themselves in country estates, leaving behind locked doors and instructions to pray harder. There was no right to health care. There was barely even an expectation of care. Healers did what they could. Families did what they could. Communities absorbed loss and kept going because stopping was not an option. Now let's gently lift our gaze back to the ruling classes, because while they had comfort, they did not have peace. Power without limits creates a strange emotional climate. Everyone around you wants something. Loyalty is conditional. Affection is strategic. A noble's life was built around appearances. Every gesture mattered. Clothing signaled rank. Speech signaled allegiance. A misstep could cost favor, income, or safety. Reputation was currency. Losing it meant social death.
which often came before the physical kind. Court life was especially exhausting. Endless ceremonies, endless observation, everyone watching everyone else, pretending not to. Rumors traveled faster than facts. Alliances shifted quietly. A smile could mean affection or warning, sometimes both. And remember, there were no protections against arbitrary punishment. A king could exile, imprison, or execute with minimal justification. Advisors learned to phrase suggestions carefully. Disagreement was dangerous. Silence was safer. This environment produced rulers who were deeply paranoid, emotionally stunted, or both. Trust was rare. Kindness was often interpreted as weakness. Cruelty was framed as decisiveness. Some monarchs tried to rule gently and were immediately overwhelmed by systems built for domination. Others leaned into absolute authority with enthusiasm, issuing laws based on personal annoyance. There were no checks to slow them down. If a king disliked a city, it paid more taxes. If he disliked a noble, that noble's estate became available. If he disliked a wife, her life became precarious. All of this was legal, because legality flowed downward from the throne. Queens existed in a particularly fragile position. They were powerful symbols, but personally vulnerable. Their status depended entirely on their husband's favor and their ability to produce heirs. A queen without sons was considered temporary. If a queen aged out of fertility or lost favor, she might be isolated, ignored, or quietly removed from influence. Divorce was rare, but annulment was possible, especially if politics demanded it. Accusations of infertility, immorality, or heresy appeared conveniently when needed. And if a queen was foreign, which many were, suspicion followed her constantly. Her accent, customs, and correspondence were all monitored. Any misfortune could be blamed on her influence. Children of royalty did not escape this pressure. They were raised in households that felt more like institutions. Wet nurses, tutors, guards. Parents appeared ceremonially. Affection was formal. Discipline was strict. Royal sons were prepared for power early, whether they wanted it or not. Royal daughters were prepared for marriage, which meant learning obedience, presentation, and silence. Emotional development was not prioritized. And if a royal child showed signs of disability or mental illness, the response was denial. They were described as delicate, melancholic, or divinely sensitive. Treatment involved prayer, isolation, and hoping the problem would not become public. Now, consider justice. Courts existed, but fairness depended heavily on status. A noble accused of a crime could expect negotiation. A commoner could expect punishment. Trials were brief. Evidence standards were flexible. Confessions were encouraged aggressively. Public executions served as reminders of authority. They were social events. Vendors sold food. Crowds gathered. The goal was not justice, but reinforcement. This is what happens when you disobey. This is who holds power. Prisons were not places of rehabilitation. They were holding spaces for punishment, ransom, or forgetting. Conditions were poor. Survival depended on outside support. If no one cared enough to bring you food, you starved. Debt was criminalized. Poverty itself was suspicious. Vagrancy laws punished people for existing without permission. Movement was restricted. You needed approval to travel, work, or settle. Freedom of movement was not a concept. Belonging was enforced. Even thought was regulated. Heresy laws controlled belief. Questioning religious doctrine could lead to exile or death. This created a culture of outward conformity and inward quiet doubt. Many people believed what they were told. Others learned to pretend convincingly. Education was limited and controlled. Literacy was power, so it was restricted. Knowledge moved slowly and selectively. Most people learned only what they needed to survive their role. Curiosity beyond that was discouraged. And yet, within all this, people lived. They married. They laughed quietly. They told stories. They complained privately. Humanity didn't disappear. It just learned to compress itself into smaller spaces. The absence of rights meant that suffering was individualized. If something bad happened to you, it was your problem. There was no framework to say it shouldn't have happened, no language to demand change, only endurance. And endurance became a virtue. The highest compliment was resilience. The strongest people were those who survived quietly. As we continue, we'll look even closer at specific lives shaped by this system, people who technically mattered most and those who didn't matter at all. Because before rights existed, value was assigned, not assumed. And that assignment could change at any moment, depending on who woke up with power that day.
We keep drifting forward, or maybe sideways, because time in this world doesn't really move toward improvement yet. It just accumulates habits. The habits harden. People adjust their expectations downward and call it realism. One of the quiet truths of a world without rights is that pain becomes administrative. It's processed through systems that don't feel personal to the people running them. Someone is taxed into hunger. Someone else signs the order. No one feels responsible. Responsibility diffuses upward until it disappears entirely. Let's talk about land, because land ownership defined almost everything. If you owned land, you mattered. If you worked land, you were replaceable. Most people lived their entire lives on property they did not own, cultivating food they would not fully eat, paying rent in crops, labor, or obedience. Leaving was rarely an option. Serfs were bound to estates. Even free peasants needed permission, money, and luck to move. Roads were poor. Suspicions, borders were unwelcome. Home was not where the heart was. Home was where you were allowed to exist. And landlords were not gentle managers. They were authorities. They collected dues, enforced customs, and settled disputes. Their word carried legal weight. If they were fair, life was tolerable. If they were cruel or careless, life was quietly brutal. There was no appeal system in the modern sense. You could petition someone higher, but that depended on access, favor, and timing. Justice was not blind. It had excellent eyesight and strong opinions about class. Women lived under particularly narrow conditions. Their legal identities were usually absorbed into fathers or husbands. Property rights were limited. Testimony was discounted. Violence within the household was considered a private matter unless it became publicly inconvenient. Marriage was framed as protection, but often functioned as transfer of control. A woman moved from one authority to another, carrying expectations of labor, obedience, and reproduction. Love was optional. Silence was preferred. Widows sometimes gained a small window of autonomy, which made widowhood quietly appealing, despite the obvious drawbacks. A woman with no husband but some property could negotiate, manage, and exist with fewer interruptions. This freedom was temporary and often resented. Children, again, were not protected. Discipline was considered formative. Harshness built character. Emotional neglect was not recognized. Loss was constant enough that attachment was cautious. If half your siblings died young, you learned not to dwell. Now let's pause briefly with the clergy, because religion filled the gap where rights might have gone. Churches provided structure, explanation, and occasional relief. They also enforced hierarchy and obedience. Priests and monks were intermediaries between people and God, which gave them authority and insulation. Some were sincere caretakers. Others were bureaucrats in robes. Corruption was common enough to be joked about, but not challenged effectively. Religious courts handled moral offenses. Punishments were public and corrective. Shame was a tool. Confession was encouraged. Surveillance was communal. Everyone watched everyone else for signs of deviation. Belief was less about faith and more about survival. Being visibly devout reduced suspicion. Being different invited attention. Attention was dangerous. Let's glide back to the elites again, because while their lives were safer materially, they were psychologically cramped. Nobles were trapped in inheritance systems that rewarded birth order and punished deviation. Firstborn sons carried enormous pressure. They were groomed to inherit titles, lands, and expectations. Failure was not an option, but competence was not guaranteed. Many inherited power they were not prepared to wield. Second sons were surplus. Some joined the church, some joined the military, some drifted, resentful and bored. Daughters were bargaining chips. Their futures were negotiated in contracts written by men who would never ask what they wanted. And inbreeding, which we should mention calmly, was not considered strange. It was practical. Keeping power within families preserved alliances and assets. Genetic consequences were poorly understood and rarely acknowledged. The result was a parade of rulers with fragile health, exaggerated features, chronic pain, infertility, and emotional instability. These were not treated as systemic problems. They were treated as individual quirks. A king with a bad temper was decisive. A king with paranoia was vigilant. A king with depression was contemplative. Language softened dysfunction because confronting it threatened the system. Wars, meanwhile, were frequent and personal. They were often launched over inheritance disputes, insults, or perceived slights. Soldiers were conscripted or coerced. Their lives were expendable resources. There were no rights for combatants. Injury meant abandonment. Captivity meant ransom or death. Veterans returned damaged and unsupported if they returned at all. The state took loyalty and offered little in return. Cities grew crowded and unsanitary. Guilds controlled trades, limiting who could work and how. Membership offered some protection, but only to insiders. Outsiders struggled. Punishment for crime varied wildly. Theft could mean execution. Nobles received fines. Justice scaled with status. Everyone knew this. No one pretended otherwise. Mental illness existed without language. People who didn't conform were labeled mad, possessed, or cursed. Treatment involved confinement, prayer, or exclusion. Compassion was inconsistent. Fear was common. And still, through all of this, daily life continued. Markets opened, bells rang, meals were cooked. People adjusted their posture to carry burdens longer without complaint. The lack of rights created a culture of internalization. Problems were personal failures. Suffering was private. Complaining was risky. So people learned to endure quietly and joke softly when possible. This endurance wasn't noble in the romantic sense. It was practical. It was the only option. Survival depended on flexibility, silence, and knowing not to be noticed. Occasionally, unrest bubbled up. Peasant revolts, bread riots, religious uprisings. These were responses to extreme pressure, not ideological movements. They were crushed efficiently and remembered selectively. Authorities framed unrest as chaos, not grievance. Order mattered more than fairness. Stability was the highest good, even if it required routine cruelty. The idea that systems could be designed to protect the vulnerable was still distant. Power protected itself. That was the design. As we move onward, we'll stay with this world a bit longer. will sit with specific figures who benefited from it and those who were consumed by it. Because before rights were a thing, lives were shaped by proximity to power, not humanity. And that proximity was never evenly distributed.
We keep going, slowly, because this world never rushes. It has nowhere to be. The systems are already in place, creaking along, grinding gently but persistently. No alarms, no emergency meetings, just the steady hum of people being managed. One thing that becomes clearer the longer you sit here is how little individual life mattered as a unit. What mattered were categories: peasant, noble, clergy, man, woman, legitimate, illegitimate. These labels decided your options before you ever spoke a word. Personality was irrelevant. Talent was a curiosity. Obedience was everything. Let's linger with legitimacy for a moment, because it quietly ruined a lot of lives. Being born outside of an approved marriage carried a permanent stain. It didn't matter who your parents were emotionally. What mattered was paperwork, witnesses, and timing. An illegitimate child inherited nothing by default. They existed adjacent to families, never fully inside them. Among royals and nobles, illegitimate children were common and awkward. Kings produced them enthusiastically. Acknowledging them was optional. Some were quietly educated and placed in the church or military. Others were ignored entirely. Their existence was a reminder of indulgence without responsibility. Legitimate heirs, meanwhile, lived under constant scrutiny. Their bodies were monitored. Their behavior was corrected. Any deviation from expectation caused anxiety. A stutter, a limp, a tendency toward melancholy. All noted, all discussed, all framed as potential threats to stability. And stability was everything. Stability justified cruelty. Stability excused neglect. Stability allowed people in power to sleep at night. Now let's drift into punishment again, because punishment reveals priorities. Corporal punishment was routine: whipping, branding, mutilation. These were not considered extreme. They were corrective. The body was a message board. Pain communicated authority clearly and cheaply. Public punishment wasn't meant to shame the individual so much as instruct the crowd. The crowd was the audience and the target. Fear was shared. That made it efficient. Execution methods varied by class. Nobles were beheaded. Commoners were hanged, burned, broken, or displayed. Even in death, hierarchy mattered. Dying well was a privilege. There was no concept of proportionality. Crimes were defined broadly. Theft could mean starvation, but punishment did not account for that. The law protected property more consistently than people. Now consider speech. Speaking out against authority was dangerous. Libel laws were vague. Insulting a ruler could be treason. Humor was risky. Satire existed, but quietly, anonymously, and with plausible deniability. Most people learned to keep opinions local and muted. Complaints were shared privately, if at all. Silence became a survival skill. Travel was restricted and exhausting. Passports existed in early forms. Permission was required. Suspicion followed strangers. Borders were emotional as well as political. Outsiders disrupted order. For women traveling alone, suspicion doubled. Respectability was fragile. Reputation traveled faster than facts. Once damaged, it rarely recovered. Let's pause again with medicine because it shaped daily anxiety. Without reliable treatment, the body was unpredictable. A small wound could kill. Childbirth was a gamble. Infections spread easily. Doctors were educated but limited. Treatments were based on ancient theories and confidence. Pain relief was minimal. Consent was not discussed. Survival was the metric. Mental health was barely acknowledged. Melancholy, hysteria, madness. Labels existed, but understanding did not. Those who struggled were isolated or mocked. Care depended on family tolerance. Now back to governance.
Laws were often inconsistent and localized. What was legal in one region might be punishable in another. This ambiguity benefited those in power. Flexibility allowed selective enforcement. Corruption was normal. Bribes smoothed processes. Favor replaced fairness. If you had connections, problems dissolved. If you didn't, problems multiplied. Taxation was heavy and unpredictable. Peasants paid in crops, labor, and money. Nobles negotiated exemptions. The burden flowed downward. When people couldn't pay, punishment followed. Occasionally, rulers noticed unrest and offered reforms. These were usually symbolic. A tax reduced temporarily, a festival declared, a proclamation of mercy, enough to calm things down without changing structure. And structure was the point. Rights threatened structure. Rights imply limits. Limits were uncomfortable. Now let's sit with family life again, because this is where the absence of rights becomes intimate. Marriage contracts focused on property and alliances. Emotional compatibility was not evaluated. Domestic violence was common and unremarkable. Intervention was rare. A household was a private domain. Authority stopped at the door unless noise or blood crossed into public inconvenience. Children witnessed everything. They learned early what power looked like. They learned when to speak and when to disappear. This education was unintentional, but thorough. Education itself was uneven. Wealthy boys received tutoring in languages, philosophy, warfare. Poor children learned trades or farming. Girls learned domestic skills. Literacy was limited. Books were expensive and controlled. Ideas moved slowly. Radical thoughts existed, but spread cautiously. Censorship was overt. Printing was monitored. And still, people imagined better lives. They just didn't imagine systems to guarantee them. Hope was personal, not structural. You hoped for a kind landlord, a gentle spouse, a healthy child, not fairness. Fairness was abstract. The absence of rights also meant the absence of expectations. If nothing is promised, nothing is violated. This psychological adjustment made endurance easier and change harder. As we move further along, keep this in mind. People were not unaware of suffering. They were immersed in it, and immersion changes perception. Before rights were a thing, life was not constantly dramatic. It was repetitive, quietly harsh, predictable in its unfairness, and that predictability became normal.
We continue, unhurried, because nothing here is urgent unless you are already in trouble. And even then, urgency is mostly your problem. The system does not speed up for individuals. By this point, it becomes clear that one of the defining features of a world without rights is how thoroughly it trains people to manage their own expectations. Hope is adjusted downward early. Disappointment becomes familiar. This isn't despair exactly, it's calibration. Let's linger for a while with aging, because growing old before rights existed was a quiet negotiation with irrelevance. If you could work, you mattered. If you could not, your value became negotiable. There were no pensions, no retirement. You worked until your body refused. When that happened, survival depended on family tolerance, charity, or luck. Old age was respected rhetorically and endured practically. Elders were sometimes valued for memory and advice, but this depended on usefulness. Sentimentality was a luxury. Food and space were limited. Kindness had to compete with survival. Now think about disability. Injury, illness, congenital conditions. Without rights, disability meant exclusion. Accommodations did not exist. Buildings were not designed for accessibility. Work was physical. If you couldn't perform, you were sidelined. Some disabled people survived by begging. Others relied on family. A few found niches as entertainers, curiosities, or religious figures. Their humanity was filtered through usefulness or symbolism. There was no legal framework to protect them from abuse. Exploitation was common. Sympathy was optional. Let's move back to the elites again, because their version of aging was different, but not easier emotionally. A noble who lost influence became invisible quickly. Youth signaled relevance. Marriage prospects, political utility. Aging queens who outlived their husbands sometimes found themselves sidelined, shuffled into quieter residences with reduced households. They were respected in theory and ignored in practice. Kings who aged poorly clung to power because there was no graceful exit. Abdication was rare and dangerous. Letting go meant vulnerability, so many ruled long past competence, surrounded by flatterers. Succession anxiety hung over every court. Heirs were watched carefully. If an heir disappointed, panic followed. If there was no heir, everything felt temporary. This anxiety spilled into marriage politics again. Young royals were paired off quickly. Fertility was monitored obsessively. Miscarriages were tracked like military losses. And remember, all of this pressure existed without emotional language to process it. Therapy did not exist. Privacy did not exist. Emotional breakdowns were rebranded as spiritual crises or temperament. Now, let's talk briefly about time, because time felt different. Without clocks governing life, days followed natural rhythms. Work began at dawn, meals were simple and repetitive, entertainment was communal and occasional. This slow pace did not equal calm, it meant endurance. Waiting was constant, waiting for harvests, waiting for decisions, waiting for someone more powerful to notice you. Bureaucracy existed, but inefficiently. Petitions were written, delivered, and forgotten. Appeals took years. Justice moved slowly unless it moved violently. Let's consider crime again, specifically desperation. Theft was often a survival strategy. Stealing food kept people alive. Dispunishment did not account for this. There was no concept of mitigating circumstances in a modern sense. Law cared about violation, not context. This created a cycle where poverty produced crime, and crime produced harsher poverty. Debtors' prisons filled with people whose only crime was failing economically. Once imprisoned, earning money became impossible. Release depended on outside help. This system benefited creditors and reinforced hierarchy. Failure was moralized. Success was proof of worth. Now, think about gender again, because women's lives were particularly narrow. Pregnancy was frequent and dangerous. Contraception was unreliable. Choice was limited. A woman might spend much of her adult life pregnant, recovering, or grieving. Each pregnancy carried risk. Each birth could be fatal. This was normalized. Men were expected to be stoic providers. Emotional expression was discouraged. Violence was tolerated. Alcohol filled gaps. Domestic spaces absorbed stress quietly. Love existed, but it had to work around structure. Romantic attachment outside marriage was risky. Illegitimacy carried consequences. Affairs were tolerated for powerful men and punished for women. Reputation was a fragile shield. Once damaged, it was almost impossible to repair. There was no appeal. Gossip functioned as social law. Let's pause briefly with education again. Knowledge was power, so it was restricted. Universities served elites. Curriculum was controlled. Radical ideas circulated privately. Those who questioned authority philosophically were tolerated until they weren't. Intellectual freedom was conditional. Heresy was a convenient charge. Now, let's return to the idea of dignity. Dignity existed, but it was not universal. It was earned through status, wealth, or service. Some people were assumed to have it, others were assumed not to need it. Humiliation was an accepted tool. Public shaming corrected behavior. Stocks, pillories, and forced displays were common. Shame kept order cheaply. And yet, people adapted emotionally.
They learned to compartmentalize, to find meaning in small things, to accept unfairness as structural rather than personal. This acceptance wasn't consent, it was survival. Resistance required resources, coordination, and imagination. Most people lacked all three. As we drift onward, keep in mind how deeply this world trained people to not expect protection. Not from rulers, not from institutions, not from fate. Before rights were a thing, life was something you managed carefully, quietly, and mostly alone. And the system was very good at staying exactly that way.
We keep moving, slowly and without urgency, because urgency belongs to people who think change is possible on demand. In this world, change happens the way erosion happens, gradually, unevenly, and usually without permission. One of the most striking features of life before rights is how completely authority occupied physical space. Power was visible. Castles on hills, manors at the center of villages, churches taller than homes. The landscape itself reminded people where they stood. Architecture enforced hierarchy. Narrow doorways, separate entrances, elevated platforms. Who stood where mattered. Who sat mattered more. Even posture was regulated. Bodies learned submission before minds ever needed to. Let's sit for a moment with the idea of consent, because it barely existed as a concept. Consent was assumed within hierarchies. A husband did not require it, a lord did not request it, a king did not acknowledge it. Marriage implied permanent consent. Employment implied obedience. Subjecthood implied loyalty. Violations within these relationships were not violations, they were privileges exercised. This extended into labor. Workers did not negotiate conditions, they accepted them. If they refused, someone else took their place. Hunger ensured compliance. Forced labor existed openly. Corvée labor required peasants to work state or lordly projects without pay. Roads, bridges, fortifications. This was not exploitation in legal terms, it was duty. Military service worked the same way. Conscription pulled men from fields and families. Training was brutal. Discipline was violent. Survival was uncertain. Desertion was punished harshly. There were no rights for soldiers either. They were property of the state while useful and discarded afterward. Injured veterans begged in streets or returned to villages with diminished capacity and no support. Let's drift back to the home again, because absence of rights is most intimate there. A household was a microstate. The head ruled, others complied. Wives had limited recourse against abuse. Children had none. Servants were dependent. Privacy did not exist. Authority was personal and immediate. Punishment within homes was invisible to the law. Bruises were not evidence. Screams were family matters. Intervention was rare unless property was damaged or neighbors complained. Now think about love again, because love survived despite everything, not because of it. People formed attachments quietly. They relied on each other emotionally where systems failed them. Friendships mattered deeply. Community bonds provided informal support. These networks were fragile but essential. They were not guaranteed. They depended on goodwill. Let's move outward to towns and cities again. Urban life offered opportunity and danger. Crowded streets, trade, guild protection if you belonged. Guilds regulated quality and membership. They protected members and excluded outsiders. Apprenticeship was long and demanding. Masters held power over apprentices' lives. If you were expelled from a guild, your livelihood disappeared. There was no appeal. Reputation was everything. Urban poor lived in dense conditions. Fires spread quickly. Disease moved easily. Policing was inconsistent. Watchmen existed but were limited. Crime was often punished publicly to maintain order. Prevention mattered less than demonstration. Now let's pause with travel again, because mobility was restricted emotionally as well as physically. Leaving home meant leaving protection. You became vulnerable to arrest, suspicion, exploitation. Passes were required, questions were asked, accents marked you. Foreigners were tolerated cautiously. For women, travel without male accompaniment invited scrutiny. Safety depended on invisibility or protection by association. Now let's consider speech again, but quieter this time. Self-censorship was constant. People learned to read rooms, to sense danger. Certain topics were avoided. Certain names were spoken carefully. Sarcasm was subtle. Humor was coded. This constant monitoring shaped personalities. People became cautious, indirect, adaptable. Emotional expression was managed carefully. Let's move back to religion again because it structured time and behavior. Calendars followed holy days. Work paused for rituals. Morality was enforced socially. Religious authorities wielded immense power. They defined sin and virtue. Confession created surveillance of the soul. For some, religion offered comfort. For others, it offered control. Often, it was both. Now think about death. Death was close. It happened at home. Bodies were prepared by family. Grief was public and communal. There were no wrongful death suits, no investigations into negligence. Death was accepted as outcome. Burial practices reflected status. Graves varied. Memory was uneven. Some lives were recorded. Most were not. And this is important. Being forgotten was normal. History remembered the powerful. Everyone else dissolved quietly. This shaped how people lived. Legacy was not expected. Survival was enough. As we continue, we'll begin to notice subtle cracks, small ideas forming, complaints phrased differently. Not rights yet, but discomfort with the absence of them. But for now, we're still firmly in the before, where power was assumed, not justified, where protection was personal, not systemic, and where most people lived carefully, quietly, and without the language to ask for more.
We keep drifting, because by now the rhythm should feel familiar, slow, predictable, slightly heavy. This is what normal felt like, not peaceful, just settled into place. One of the subtler effects of living without rights is how it reshapes ambition. People didn't dream expansively, they dreamed narrowly. A better harvest, a kinder master, a marriage that wasn't miserable. Large-scale change wasn't part of the imagination for most people because it wasn't part of experience. Ambition that reached too far was dangerous. Standing out invited attention. Attention invited scrutiny. Scrutiny rarely ended well. So most people learned to blend in, to become unremarkable. This was not a lack of creativity, it was a survival strategy. Let's sit with poverty again, because poverty before rights was not temporary for most. It was inherited. If you were born poor, you stayed poor. There were exceptions, but they were rare enough to be stories. Debt trapped families for generations. Obligations passed down. Landless laborers remained landless. Opportunity was not evenly distributed. It barely existed. Charity helped occasionally, but it was unpredictable and often humiliating. Accepting aid meant accepting judgment. Gratitude was required. Silence was expected. Now think about law again, specifically who wrote it. Laws were written by elites for elites. Common people were subjects of law, not participants in it. Representation did not exist. Petitions were allowed, but they were requests, not rights. They could be ignored without consequence. This meant that injustice was not framed as a system failure. It was framed as fate, or bad luck, or personal failing. Let's move back to the family again, because that's where this worldview was reinforced daily. Children watched adults submit. They learned early that resistance was costly. Education reinforced obedience. Moral lessons emphasized humility, patience, and acceptance. Pride was dangerous. Questioning was sinful. Now let's look at entertainment, because even leisure reflected hierarchy. Festivals were rare breaks. Music, dancing, drinking, controlled release of tension. These events were supervised, rules applied. Excess could be punished.
Joy was permitted, but briefly and under watch. Storytelling often reinforced social order. Tales warned against ambition. Characters who challenged authority met bad ends. Moral clarity favored obedience. Now drift back to the elites again, because their boredom mattered more than common people's suffering. Aristocrats sought novelty, hunting, affairs, patronage of art. Art flourished under patronage, but served power. Portraits emphasized lineage and authority. History was written selectively. Failures were reframed. Cruelty was justified. Royal courts became theaters. Everyone played a role. Authenticity was risky. Performance was survival. This performance extended to morality. Elites were held to different standards. Affairs were tolerated. Violence was excused. Hypocrisy was expected. Now think about rebellion again, but quieter. Most resistance was small. Work slowed. Tools broke. Crops were hidden. Compliance was strategic. These acts were not ideological, they were practical. Survival tactics disguised as incompetence. Large revolts happened rarely and ended badly. Leaders were executed, communities were punished. Memory of failure discouraged repetition. Fear worked. It always has. Let's pause with communication. News traveled slowly. Rumors filled gaps. Misinformation spread easily. Authority controlled messaging when possible. Printing increased circulation, but censorship followed quickly. Books were monitored. Ideas were dangerous. Now think about borders again. National identity was weak. Loyalty was local. People identified with villages, lords, parishes. Rights require abstraction. Citizenship requires imagination. Neither was fully developed yet. People belonged to someone, not to a state in the modern sense. Belonging could be revoked. Now let's consider punishment one more time, because repetition matters. Punishment was not about correcting individuals, it was about reminding everyone else. Public suffering normalized cruelty. Watching became routine. Empathy dulled. This wasn't because people were heartless, it was because constant exposure requires emotional distance. Now sit with illness again. Chronic pain was common. Work continued anyway. Rest was not valued. There were no sick days, no disability leave. You worked until you couldn't, then you adjusted downward. This shaped how bodies were treated. Bodies were tools. Wear was expected. And finally, let's talk about silence. Silence was the dominant sound of this world. Not literal silence, but social silence. People did not articulate grievances. They endured, they adapted, they whispered. Before rights were a thing, silence was safer than speech. Endurance was praised, and survival was considered success. And this mindset held everything together, quietly, for centuries.
We keep going, still unhurried, because this world never builds toward a climax. It just keeps layering weight. By now, everything feels heavy, in a familiar way. Not shocking, just tiring. One of the last things to really settle in if you sit with this long enough is how thoroughly inequality was normalized. It wasn't argued for, it didn't need justification, it simply was. Like gravity. Some people were above, most people were below. Asking why would have sounded childish. People didn't compare their lives to an abstract ideal. They compared them to yesterday. If today was not worse, that was acceptable. Improvement was incremental, accidental, and often temporary. Let's spend some time with justice again, but this time from the perspective of those who enforced it. Officials, guards, constables, minor bureaucrats. These were not monsters. They were ordinary people given authority without accountability. Their power was small but immediate. A fine, an arrest, a beating, a report written poorly or not at all. For someone on the receiving end, this power felt enormous. Abuse of authority was common because nothing discouraged it. Complaints went nowhere. Witnesses stayed quiet. Reputation protected enforcers more than truth ever did. This created a culture of arbitrary enforcement. Laws existed, but how they were applied depended on mood, bias, and opportunity. Consistency was not a goal.
Now let's return to women again, because absence of rights pressed hardest on them over time. Pregnancy after pregnancy, labor after labor, loss after loss, with little recognition and no real choice. Midwives existed and did what they could. Female knowledge circulated quietly. Herbal remedies, advice, warnings. This knowledge was informal and vulnerable to suppression. When something went wrong, blame followed women. Infertility, miscarriage, stillbirth, all moralized, all personalized. The system was never at fault. Witchcraft accusations fit neatly into this framework. Women who were poor, old, outspoken, or inconvenient became targets. Fear and resentment crystallized into accusation. Trials were unfair, evidence was imagined, confessions were extracted. Communities purged anxiety by sacrificing the vulnerable. This was not constant everywhere, but it was possible everywhere. That possibility alone kept many women cautious and quiet. Now think about masculinity again. Men were expected to endure hardship without complaint. Vulnerability was weakness. Failure was shameful. This pressure produced violence outward and inward. Alcohol abuse was common. Rage had acceptable outlets. Tenderness did not. Men who failed economically lost status quickly. Respect was conditional. Worth was measured in provision and obedience. Children absorbed these models. Boys learned silence and force. Girls learned compliance and endurance. These lessons repeated. Let's sit with memory for a moment. History, as recorded, focused on rulers, wars, treaties. Daily suffering rarely made it into records. This absence reinforces the illusion that life was quieter, more simpler than it was. It wasn't. It was just undocumented. Millions lived and died without leaving traces. Their experiences shaped societies without ever being acknowledged. Now let's move toward the edges of change, though not into it yet. Small shifts appear. Merchants gain influence. Cities grow wealthier. Money complicates hierarchy. Power begins to diffuse slightly, not evenly, not kindly, but enough to introduce tension. Merchants want predictability, contracts, stability. They don't talk about rights yet. They talk about order and reliability. This creates friction with aristocracy, which prefers flexibility and privilege. Systems strain quietly. Education spreads slowly. Literacy increases among non-elites. Ideas circulate wider. Not revolutionary yet, just irritating. People begin to notice patterns. Not injustice exactly, inconsistency, arbitrary rule, unfairness as inefficiency. These are early discomforts, not demands. Still safe to ignore, still easy to suppress. But even noticing is new. Let's pause again with fear, because fear remains the primary regulator. Fear of punishment, fear of exclusion, fear of hunger. Fear works best when it is predictable, and for centuries it was. The absence of rights meant that safety was personal, not guaranteed. You were safe because someone protected you, or because you were unnoticed, or because nothing had gone wrong yet. This created gratitude for minimal mercy, a kind word from a lord, a reduced tax, a delayed punishment. Gratitude replaced expectation, and gratitude kept systems intact. Now think about dignity one last time in this part. Dignity existed, but it was internal, something you carried quietly, something no one promised to respect. People found dignity in skill, endurance, faith, family, not in institutions. Institutions did not exist to protect dignity, they existed to manage populations. Before rights were a thing, that was enough. Enough to survive, enough to continue. And so the world kept turning, not toward justice, but toward repetition.
We continue on, still moving at that same steady pace, because this world doesn't rush toward enlightenment. It circles slowly, like it's not quite sure it wants to commit. By now, the absence of rights isn't something you notice sharply. It's something you feel like gravity, always there, always pulling. At this stage, it's worth sitting with the idea of choice, because choice was narrower than we tend to imagine. Most decisions were already made by birth, where you lived, what you did, who you answered to. The remaining choices were small and practical: how hard to work, when to stay silent, when to endure a little longer. Choice existed mostly for elites, and even then it was constrained by expectation. A prince could choose a mistress, not a future. A noble could choose loyalty, not independence. Everyone operated inside invisible fences. For common people, stepping outside expectation invited correction. Dress codes enforced class boundaries. Speech patterns signaled rank. Even body language gave you away. You learned early how not to attract attention. Let's spend a little time with clothing, because it quietly enforced hierarchy. Sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what. Certain colors, fabrics, and styles were reserved for elites. Wearing the wrong thing could lead to fines or punishment. Clothing wasn't just fashion, it was permission. It told the world how to treat you, and it told you how to treat yourself. Now drift back into the household again, because that's where power rehearsed itself daily. Meals were eaten in order of status. The head ate first, servants waited, children observed. This ordering wasn't cruel by intention, it was habitual. But habit is powerful. It teaches people where they belong without explanation. Domestic service was one of the few ways poor people interacted closely with elites. Servants lived inside wealth without sharing it. They saw comfort daily and were expected not to want it. Servants had little privacy and few protections. Dismissal meant homelessness. Abuse was common. Gratitude was expected. Loyalty was demanded. Now let's talk about reputation again, because reputation functioned like an early social credit system. Once damaged, recovery was unlikely. Accusations stuck. Defending yourself required witnesses, money, and influence. Silence was often safer than protest. This made false accusations particularly dangerous, and since authority decided truth, the powerful were rarely wrong. Now let's pause with punishment again, but this time emotional punishment. Exile, ostracism, loss of status. These were devastating in tightly knit societies. Being cut off meant losing protection. People feared social death as much as physical death. This fear kept people compliant. You didn't just risk yourself, you risked your family. Let's move outward again to economics, because money began to complicate things quietly. Cash economies grew. Wages appeared more often. This didn't mean fairness, it meant dependency shifted. Employers replaced landlords in some places. Power remained unequal. Workers had slightly more mobility but no protections. Losing a job meant hunger. Bargaining power was minimal. Markets expanded, trade increased. With it came exposure to other ways of living. This comparison mattered. Seeing alternatives made endurance harder. If life could be different somewhere else, then maybe suffering wasn't purely natural. But this realization stayed vague, dangerous to articulate. Now think about law again, but this time contracts. Contracts benefited merchants and elites. They created predictability. But contracts didn't protect those without leverage. A contract between unequal parties was still unequal. Breaking a contract could be criminal. Exploitation wrapped in legality was still exploitation. Now let's return to the elites one more time, because their anxieties intensified as systems grew more complex. Absolute power felt less absolute when money moved independently. Kings still ruled by decree, but they needed funds. Parliaments appeared in limited forms. Assemblies advised, occasionally resisted. This wasn't democracy, it was negotiation among elites. Common people remained excluded. Their suffering still registered only when it disrupted order. Let's sit briefly with the idea of mercy. Mercy existed, but it was discretionary. A ruler could pardon. A judge could show leniency. Mercy was celebrated because it was rare, and because it reinforced power. Mercy reminded people who could have punished instead. There was no right to mercy, only hope. This shaped behavior. People begged rather than demanded. They pleaded rather than argued. Now think about time again, because generations passed without structural change. Parents taught children how to survive the same systems. This continuity created resignation. If nothing has changed for centuries, why would it change now? That belief was powerful. It stabilized injustice. But it also created cracks, quiet dissatisfaction, weariness. Not rage yet, just fatigue, and fatigue accumulates. As we drift onward, we're getting closer to a world where the idea of rights can be imagined, not implemented, just imagined. But for now, we're still in the before, where survival is individual, protection is personal, and fairness is incidental. Where life continues not because it is just, but because stopping would require permission no one intends to give. We keep moving, still at that same unbroken pace, because nothing in this world arrives suddenly. Even change tiptoes. By now, the absence of rights feels less like a condition and more like atmosphere. It's just the air everyone breathes. At this point, it helps to sit with the idea of voice. Not speech exactly, but voice as influence. Who could speak and be heard? Who could complain and be answered? In a world without rights, voice followed power. You could speak endlessly and still be silent if no one was required to listen. And no one was required to listen to most people. Petitions existed, but they were performances of humility. You didn't assert injustice, you begged for relief. You praised authority first. You framed suffering as unfortunate rather than unfair. Language mattered. Calling something unjust implied standards. Standards implied obligation. Obligation was dangerous. So people learned careful phrasing, loyal phrasing, apologetic phrasing, even when starving. Now let's talk about obedience again, because obedience was not just demanded, it was moralized. Obedience meant goodness. Disobedience meant disorder. Children were praised for compliance. Adults were rewarded for loyalty. Questioning authority was framed as selfish or sinful. This framing made resistance feel wrong, even when suffering was obvious. Let's drift back into work again, because labor consumed most of life. Long hours, repetitive tasks, physical strain. Craft pride existed, skill mattered, but safety did not. Injuries were accepted, deaths were absorbed. Workplaces were not regulated. Tools were dangerous. Accidents were common. Responsibility ended at the door. If someone died working, families mourned. Employers replaced them. Life went on. Now think about time off. Rest was rare. Holy days provided pauses. Festivals offered distraction. These breaks were tolerated because they released pressure. Controlled release kept systems stable. Too much rest was suspicious. Idleness suggested rebellion or moral failure. Now let's return to punishment one more time, because it underpinned everything. Punishment was swift when authority felt threatened, slow when victims were powerless. Justice favored order over fairness, always. This wasn't hidden, it was accepted. Now let's sit with empathy, because empathy existed but had limits. People empathized within their group, family, village, guild. Beyond that, suffering blurred. Too much pain to track, too little power to address it. Empathy without power becomes exhaustion. People learned to narrow it. Now think about hope again, but differently. Hope was not about systems improving. It was about personal fortune. A good marriage, a lucky patron, a healthy child, a forgiving Lord. Structural change was not imagined, because imagination requires reference points. Now let's drift toward the idea of order. Order was sacred. Chaos was feared. Order meant predictability. Predictability meant survival. Even unfair predictability was preferable to uncertainty. This preference explains why oppressive systems lasted so long. They were stable. Now consider communication again. Gossip carried information. Official news carried propaganda. Truth was local. Authority controlled narrative when it mattered. People learned to separate public truth from private truth. This double consciousness was normal. Now let's talk about punishment of thought again, but softly. Blasphemy, sedition, heresy. These crimes punished imagination. They policed belief. Punishing thought kept people from articulating alternatives. Now we're very close to the edge of this world, though still inside it. You can sense the pressure building. More people can read. More people trade. More people notice inconsistency. But nothing has broken yet. Before rights were a thing, change required more than suffering. It required coordination, language, and courage, and those were still forming. So the world continues, heavy but familiar, unfair but stable, waiting without knowing what it's waiting for.
We keep moving, slow and deliberate, because in this world, time is measured less by events than by endurance. Days stretch, weeks blend, seasons repeat. Nothing accelerates, nothing demands attention except the occasional reminder of authority. By now, it should be clear that survival in a world without rights is both physical and psychological. Your body must endure labor, illness, and injury. Your mind must endure hierarchy, neglect, and unpredictability. Both are constant. Both are expected. Let's linger with the concept of health, because it was always precarious. Illness moved freely. Epidemics arrived without warning. Treatments were limited. Remedies were inconsistent. Herbal knowledge existed but was unevenly distributed. Prayers and rituals were common. Sometimes they worked. Often they didn't. And there was no expectation that anyone would intervene systematically to keep people alive. You survived because you were lucky, clever, or protected, or not. Childbirth remained one of the riskiest events in life. Mortality rates were high for mothers and infants alike. Preparation was minimal. Midwives and family offered guidance, but no one guaranteed outcomes. Complications were reframed as divine will or fate. No one considered negligence. No one considered legal responsibility. It simply was. Now let's turn to work again, because labor occupied nearly every waking hour. Most people had jobs they could not leave: fields, workshops, mines, domestic service. Tasks were long, repetitive, and physically demanding. Tools were crude, accidents common. If you survived, you endured. If you didn't, someone else took your place without complaint. Work was constant, rest was scarce, and complaining was unsafe. Guilds, for those lucky enough to belong, offered protection, skill training, and relative stability. But they were insular. Membership was selective. Outsiders had no leverage. Apprentices were at the mercy of masters. Mistreatment was normal. Discipline was harsh. Survival was a form of education. Let's return to family life, because domestic spaces reinforced social hierarchy. Husbands exercised authority. Fathers guided obedience. Children internalized hierarchy. Wives navigated restrictions, pregnancy, and domestic labor. Affection existed quietly, selectively,
privately. Emotional comfort was optional. Emotional harm was tolerated, often normalized. Marriage remained a transfer of authority. Women moved from one male authority to another. Their legal and social identity was bound to men. Pregnancy, childbirth, and household management were constant expectations. Love was optional. Compliance was essential. And yet, within these strict confines, life persisted. People found ways to laugh softly, tell stories, share food, and nurture children. Survival created ingenuity. Silence encouraged creativity. Private networks formed, sustaining people in ways the system never recognized. Now consider punishment again, because it shaped everything. Corporal punishment, public shaming, fines, and imprisonment reminded people where they stood. Nobles were punished differently, commoners more severely. Severity correlated with visibility, not justice. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was an efficient way to maintain order. Even small infractions were visible. Gossip reinforced accountability. Reputation functioned as an early regulatory system. Losing face was dangerous. Losing protection could be fatal. Silence and caution became survival strategies. Let's pause with social mobility, because opportunities existed but were rare and uneven. The majority of people inherited position, status, and limitations. Mobility depended on luck, patronage, or exceptional skill. Trade, craft, and service offered small openings. Education and literacy expanded slowly. Knowledge could shift lives slightly, but never completely. Power remained concentrated. Now consider elites again, because their lives were superficially comfortable, but emotionally precarious. Nobles feared rivals. Kings feared heirs. Queens feared childbirth and court intrigue. Mistakes were costly. Power was fragile. Appearance mattered more than authenticity. Loyalty was conditional. Trust was rare. Anxiety was constant. Even for the powerful, rights did not exist. They could exert authority freely, but they could also fall prey to the whims of more powerful figures. Fortune was fickle. Legacy depended on survival, cunning, and the ability to play roles convincingly. Now return briefly to everyday survival. Hunger persisted seasonally, illness persisted daily. Violence lurked in work, home, and public spaces. People endured, not because they expected fairness, but because endurance was the only strategy available. Expectations were calibrated to the system. Disappointment was habitual. And finally, consider the quiet mental adaptation. People learned patience. They learned to suppress frustration. They learned subtlety in speech and body language. They learned endurance as a skill, not virtue, not heroic, just necessary. Before rights were a thing, life was largely invisible. You moved through a dense structure of authority, obligation, and expectation. Protection was personal or absent. Justice was conditional. Survival was ordinary. And still, people lived. They adapted. They found meaning in small spaces. They learned quietly to exist in a world that assumed their compliance, without promise, without consideration, without rights.
We continue, slow and steady, because this world doesn't move toward resolution. It moves in layers, quietly accumulating pressure that few notice. By now, you begin to see how deeply systems shape behavior before rights existed, not with explosions, but with repetition. One of the more subtle features of life was predictability in its unfairness. You could anticipate suffering, and that made it tolerable. Hunger arrived seasonally, taxes arrived when expected,
Punishment arrived promptly when rules were broken. The uncertainty was selective. Survival became an exercise in reading patterns, noticing authority, and measuring endurance. Let's linger with childhood again, because early life taught the most important lesson: obedience. Children were carefully trained to exist within hierarchy. They observed how adults navigated authority. They learned which words were safe, which gestures were allowed. Affection was optional, discipline constant. Play existed, but often under supervision. Risk and consequence were never abstract, they were immediate. Education reflected this. Formal schooling existed mostly for elites. For commoners, knowledge was functional: reading, writing, counting. Enough to manage tasks, conduct trade, or follow instructions. Curiosity was tolerated within boundaries, not encouraged. Asking why was dangerous. Learning too much threatened the existing order. Now let's move back to work. Labor was a form of containment. It kept people occupied, productive, and visible. Crops needed tending. Workshops needed apprentices. Mines needed hands. Daily routines left little room for reflection. Exhaustion became a shield. Exhaustion kept compliance high. You survived, and in surviving, you forgot to demand more. Food remained unevenly distributed. Elites ate richly, others ate minimally. Periodic scarcity was normal. Starvation was a quiet teacher. It taught patience, cunning, and caution. Those who survived adapted. Those who didn't became part of the invisible population remembered only in census rolls, tax records, or nothing at all. Let's consider law again, because the law was less about fairness than about containment. Judges interpreted rules according to status. Nobles could negotiate, peasants could not. Punishments were public, carefully displayed, and symbolic. Justice was predictable only if you understood the rules of hierarchy. Otherwise, it was arbitrary and frightening. Now think about health and medicine. Illness was a constant companion. Life expectancy was shorter. Pain was normal. Remedies were limited. Bloodletting, purges, and prayers were standard treatments. Survival often depended on luck or social connections. There was no right to health care, no expectation of care, and no protection from negligence. Religion filled some of these gaps. Clergy offered guidance, ritual, and consolation. They also enforced obedience. Moral policing kept people compliant. The church monitored behavior, guided belief, and provided structure. Faith was sometimes sincere, sometimes strategic, but it rarely protected anyone from harm. Now let's drift back to elites briefly, because their position highlights the fragility of life without rights at the top. Kings, queens, and nobles enjoyed comfort, but not security. They navigated courts, alliances, and reputations constantly. One misstep could cost influence, property, or life. Anxiety, paranoia, and manipulation were normal. Power was absolute only in theory. In practice, it was conditional, relational, and delicate. Marriage politics shaped their lives. Alliances, dowries, heirs, succession, everything was calculated. Personal desire existed but was subordinate to necessity. Emotional life was often constrained by duty and expectation. Even love could become a liability. Now return to daily life for ordinary people. Silence remained critical. Speaking out invited danger. Complaining was rare. Resistance existed, but mostly as small acts, a delayed task, a hidden crop, a subtle refusal. Revolts were rare, crushed quickly, and remembered selectively. Fear ensured that most people conformed quietly. Economic dependence reinforced obedience. Tenants, laborers, apprentices all relied on someone with power. Losing favor meant losing survival. Freedom existed only as a shadow, a hypothetical choice that came at extreme risk. Let's pause briefly with communication. Gossip, rumor, and coded speech allowed people to share knowledge while avoiding scrutiny. Subtlety was survival. People learned to say one thing while meaning another. Observation became a skill. Reading the mood of authority became a daily exercise. Now consider dignity, which existed internally rather than externally. People found small ways to assert autonomy, choosing a friend, protecting a child, crafting something skillfully. These small acts preserved a sense of self in a world that offered no systemic recognition. Finally, consider endurance. Endurance was the quiet currency of daily life, surviving another day, feeding a family, withstanding injustice without complaint, observing hierarchy without rebellion. Endurance replaced rights. It substituted for protection, fairness, and opportunity, and it was practiced constantly, unconsciously, universally. Before rights were a thing, life was not dramatic. It was slow, repetitive, and quietly harsh. Comfort was conditional. Safety was personal. Justice was relative. Survival, patience, and observation were skills, not virtues. And this, in essence, was the rhythm of the world, persistent, measured, and normalized in its inequality. A world designed to continue exactly as it had for centuries, with people learning quietly, softly, how to exist within it.
We continue, drifting slowly, because in this world, change does not announce itself. It creeps, it whispers, it tests boundaries before anything breaks. By now, most people have learned not to expect fairness, not to expect protection, not to expect recognition. And that expectation, or rather the lack of it, has become a rhythm, a quiet hum beneath daily life. Yet even in such a steady world, subtle cracks begin to appear. Small tensions, barely noticeable at first, accumulate over time. Merchants notice that agreements sometimes favor the elite more than the letter of the deal. Farmers notice that rents are rising faster than harvests can support. Servants notice that punishments are arbitrary. Children notice that the rules adults live by don't seem to apply equally. These observations are quiet, often unspoken, but they exist. People do not yet demand change. That would be dangerous. What they do is notice. They begin to calculate risk, to measure patterns, to find tiny ways to regain control where they can. An apprentice might deliberately slow production. A laborer might withhold part of the harvest. A widow might negotiate rent reductions quietly. Resistance is small, private, strategic. It doesn't threaten the system, it survives within it. Let's think about elites again, because the contrast highlights how fragile authority really is. Kings and queens appear invincible in portraits, in records, in stories. In reality, their days are punctuated by anxieties. Succession, loyalty, health, and reputation are constant worries. A misstep in diplomacy, a miscalculated alliance, a neglected heir, any of these could unravel years of careful planning. Privilege does not eliminate vulnerability, it reframes it. Marriage politics continue to dominate elite lives. Alliances are calculated. Daughters are bargaining chips. Sons are heirs first, individuals second. Personal desire is optional. Obedience to family strategy is mandatory. Affection, when it exists, must navigate a maze of expectations, scrutiny, and long-term consequences. Now drift back to ordinary life, where observation, endurance, and subtlety dominate. A tenant learns which words to speak to avoid attention from the Lord. A craftsman watches which customers are trustworthy, which guild rules are enforced. Children learn early that the world is hierarchical and unyielding. They watch adults, they adapt, they endure. They understand that survival depends on caution, not protest. Religion remains a stabilizing force. Rituals structure time. Morality instructs behavior. Clergy enforce hierarchy, subtly shaping social norms. Confession, penance, and ritualized obedience maintain order quietly.
Deviance is noticed, corrected, and rarely excused. Faith functions as guidance, but also as monitoring. It does not guarantee protection or fairness. Punishment continues to teach. Public shaming, corporal punishment, fines, imprisonment. Severity scales with status. Observing these punishments, people internalize rules, absorb hierarchy, and learn endurance. The system relies on predictability more than morality. Fear is constant, measured, and carefully maintained. Silence persists as a survival tool. Speaking out can draw attention. Silence protects. Compliance is safer than complaint. Small acts of defiance are private and coded. Gossip circulates knowledge without risking exposure. Observation becomes expertise. Subtlety is skill. Health and labor remain precarious. Epidemics, injuries, childbirth, these are constant hazards. Medical knowledge is limited. Healing is inconsistent. Survival often depends on luck, social connection, or careful adaptation. Disability is rarely accommodated. Life continues regardless. Food and resources continue to depend on hierarchy. Scarcity is normalized. Generosity exists, but selectively, as a tool of authority rather than obligation. Those who possess are expected to distribute. Those who lack are expected to endure. Gratitude replaces rights. Endurance replaces security. And yet, even within these constraints, life persists. People form bonds. Family ties provide shelter. Friends offer subtle protection. Communities develop informal rules that supplement or replace authority. Humor, storytelling, ritual, and song provide relief. Private joy exists, quietly, carefully, without threatening the larger structure. Now, in this accumulation of observation and endurance, we can detect a slight shift. People begin to imagine alternatives, not loudly, not collectively, but privately. They notice inconsistencies. They question fairness in whispers. They weigh their options. They calculate risk. These quiet mental adjustments lay the groundwork for what will, centuries later, become the concept of rights. Before rights were a thing, life was slow, structured, and unevenly harsh. Yet within it, people learned patience, caution, endurance, and subtle forms of resistance. These small adjustments became their survival toolkit. They did not revolt. They adapted. They observed. They endured. And in this quiet, repetitive, careful observation, the first seeds of awareness begin to sprout. Soft, tentative, private. People notice what could be different, even if no one yet dares to name it.
We continue, slowly and softly, because nothing in this world moves quickly, except the occasional illness or misfortune. By now, the patterns should feel familiar. Hierarchy, endurance, observation, silence. Life is predictable in its unfairness, and people have learned to inhabit that predictability with quiet skill. Yet even in this slow rhythm, subtle accumulations begin to appear. Small deviations, tiny observations, private adjustments. These are the beginnings of social awareness, though not yet rights. A peasant notices that some taxes can be negotiated, others not. A merchant observes that contracts favor certain buyers and punish others unfairly. A servant realizes that withholding a small effort can protect dignity without attracting punishment. These tiny calibrations are survival tactics, but they also plant seeds of thought. This could be otherwise. Childhood remains a masterclass in adaptation. Boys and girls absorb hierarchy as if it were natural law. They see adults negotiating with power, enduring without protest, finding private relief in play or storytelling. These lessons are unspoken, yet deeply internalized. Children understand that the world works according to rules that protect some and ignore others, and that survival requires careful reading of those rules. Let's sit again with elites. Kings, queens, nobles, they continue to enjoy comfort, but live with anxiety. Succession, loyalty, alliances, and reputation are constant pressures. The slightest misstep can undo years of careful management. Personal desire exists, but it must navigate family, politics, and expectation. Affection is tolerated when convenient. Obedience is expected at every level. Power is never absolute. It is relational, delicate, and always provisional. Marriage politics continue to dominate elite life. Daughters are instruments of alliance. Sons are heirs first, individuals second. Love is a luxury, sometimes permitted, sometimes dangerous. Emotional life is structured by duty, by expectation, by observation of what others consider acceptable. Even pleasure must conform to hierarchy. Now drift back to ordinary life. Work dominates. Fields, workshops, mines, and domestic labor consume most hours. Tools are crude, accidents common, and exhaustion a constant companion. Labor teaches endurance. It teaches humility. It teaches observation. Mistakes are costly. Survival depends on caution. Small acts of discretion, quiet defiance, and selective obedience become skills. Religion continues to structure both time and thought. Rituals, prayers, and festivals impose a rhythm on life. Clergy monitor behavior and enforce morality. Faith provides comfort, but also compliance. Deviance is noted, corrected, and rarely excused. Spiritual authority overlaps with social authority, reinforcing hierarchy. Punishment remains a central method of maintaining order. Public shaming, corporal punishment, fines, and imprisonment teach rules. Severity scales with status. Observing punishment, people internalize hierarchy and learn endurance. The system depends more on predictability than fairness. Fear is constant, measured, and deliberately maintained. Silence remains the safest option for most people. Speaking out risks attention, punishment, or worse. Compliance becomes instinct. Private resistance is subtle, delaying tasks, withholding effort, negotiating quietly, or finding small joys that do not threaten authority. Gossip and rumors circulate knowledge safely. Observation becomes skill. Subtlety becomes survival. Health and mortality continue to shape daily life. Epidemics, injuries, and childbirth are ongoing hazards. Medical knowledge is limited. Treatments are inconsistent. Survival often depends on luck or social connections. Disability is rarely accommodated. Life continues regardless. Food and resources remain controlled by hierarchy. Scarcity is normal. Generosity exists, but selectively and often as a tool of authority rather than obligation. Gratitude replaces rights. Endurance replaces security. And yet, even within these constraints, life persists. People find bonds of comfort, family, friends, community. Humor, storytelling, ritual, and song offer private relief. Small acts of autonomy preserve dignity. These private spaces become a quiet form of resistance. Gradually, over generations, these accumulations, observation, endurance, subtle defiance, imagination, create awareness. People begin to notice patterns, inequities, and possibilities. Not yet loudly, not yet collectively, but privately, in small groups, in whispered conversations, in choices made daily, awareness grows. Before rights were a thing, life was slow, repetitive, and quietly harsh. Yet within it, humans learned patience, subtlety, endurance, and imagination. These small, private adjustments laid the groundwork for future concepts of justice, fairness, and protection, ideas that had not yet been named but were slowly being conceived in the margins of daily life. And in this quiet persistence, this careful, measured existence, the world continued, unchanged in structure, but quietly accumulating the awareness that would one day challenge it.
We continue, still slow, still steady, because in this world nothing happens suddenly. Change creeps like moss over stone. Generations live, observe, and adapt, and only slowly does awareness accumulate. By now, patterns are familiar: hierarchy, endurance, observation, silence. Yet beneath the surface, subtle shifts begin to emerge. These shifts are quiet. They do not announce themselves. They appear in the small, practical choices people make. A tenant negotiates slightly lower rent. A craftsman hides part of his production to avoid a greedy master. A servant delays a task just enough to assert minor autonomy without attracting punishment. These are not rebellions, they are strategies. But over time, they accumulate. They teach people that small adjustments are possible, that not everything is predetermined, and that authority, while powerful, is not infallible. Childhood continues to shape understanding. Boys and girls internalize hierarchy through observation and experience. They see adults negotiating, enduring, adapting. Play is a teaching ground, a place to experiment with rules, alliances, and influence. Children learn subtlety, patience, and the value of discretion. These lessons are practical. They are survival skills, and they prepare the next generation to navigate the same slow, uneven system. Elites remain anxious despite comfort. Kings, queens, and nobles enjoy wealth, food, and ceremony, but power is never secure. Succession, loyalty, alliances, reputation, all remain delicate. One poorly chosen ally, one rumor, one misjudged gesture, and authority falters. Emotional life is tightly managed. Affection exists, but must be measured. Pleasure is tolerated, never unconstrained. Status requires constant performance. Power is provisional, conditional, and relational. Marriage politics continue as a tool of strategy. Daughters are alliances, sons are heirs. Love is secondary. Obedience to family or dynasty is primary. The private, personal dimension of life is always filtered through duty and expectation. Even the most intimate moments are carefully navigated. Ordinary life continues with labor and endurance. Fields, workshops, mines, and domestic spaces dominate. Tools are crude. Accidents are common. Fatigue is constant. Survival is an ongoing calculation: how to work enough to live without attracting undue attention. Observation, subtle defiance, and strategic compliance are survival tools. Religion continues to structure behavior and thought. Rituals mark time. Clergy enforce social norms. Faith offers comfort, but also reinforces hierarchy. Deviance is corrected. Moral oversight shapes both private and public life. Compliance is both spiritual and social. Punishment remains a teaching tool. Public shaming, fines, and corporal punishment reinforce the rules. Severity is proportional to status. Observation of punishment trains everyone else to comply. The system depends less on fairness than on predictability. Fear is constant, structured, and deliberate. Silence remains protective. Speaking out invites scrutiny, punishment, or worse. Compliance is safer than complaint. Subtle defiance is quiet. delaying work, withholding effort, negotiating quietly, finding private joy. Gossip circulates knowledge safely. Observation becomes skill. Subtlety becomes survival. Health and mortality continue to shape life. Epidemics, injuries, childbirth, hazards are constant. Medical knowledge is inconsistent. Treatments are unpredictable. Survival relies on luck, social connections, and cautious adaptation. Disability is rarely accommodated. Life persists regardless. Food and resources remain hierarchical. Scarcity is normal. Generosity exists selectively, often to reinforce authority. Gratitude replaces rights. Endurance replaces security. Dignity becomes internalized, preserved in small choices, small acts, private autonomy. And yet, over generations, these accumulations, endurance, observation, subtle resistance, private imagination, begin to shift consciousness. People notice patterns, inequities, and possibilities. They whisper observations, form small private strategies, and imagine alternatives. Not yet collectively, not yet loudly, but awareness begins. Before rights were a thing, life was slow, repetitive, quietly harsh. Yet humans learned subtlety, endurance, observation, and private imagination. These small adaptations preserved dignity, fostered survival, and planted seeds of awareness. And in this quiet persistence, the world continued, unchanged on the surface, yet slowly becoming capable of imagining something more, something we would one day call rights.